today. We want to start with part 3, and we're taking up the amazing Thomas Jefferson. Okay, and he is amazing to me. I said it's wonderful to look at all that these folks have accomplished. And so in researching this matter, I mentioned last week that I actually went to Peacefield in Massachusetts and saw the place where John Adams and John Quincy Adams lived, their home place. But in researching about Jefferson, I also visited some places, including the wonderful Monticello. And I was corrected, by the way. I've gone through life calling it Monticello, and which is the way you say it in Tennessee, I think. That would be the appropriate way to say it. But anyway, but I was corrected when I was out there, and a lady who was on site who knew better about these things than I said it's Monticello. So I remembered that from now on. I passed that on to you. Yeah, that's right. Thomas Jefferson is one of our most celebrated presidents, and that's almost an understatement. Other than probably George Washington, he's been more celebrated than any of our presidents in a way. He's one of the 4 presidents whose image is carved on Mount Rushmore. That's pretty good. Many locations in America are named after him, including Jefferson City, Missouri. I didn't know that until I began looking into this. Many people who are watching this presentation, that's you and others who will, are carrying his image and a picture of his house with you. That is, if you have a nickel in your pocket or your purse, on the nickel you'll see Jefferson's image, and then his house, Monticello, is on the backside. Hey, what that means, by the way, Monticello, it means little mountain. It's Italian, I think. So then in Washington, D.C., we have the Jefferson Memorial, an amazing structure. This is a building. Imagine this. They built a beautiful building. It's rotund and it's amazing. All that's in there is a statue of Jefferson, and then on the walls are his words, things he said. Very, very powerful. So I mentioned that we would like to put together and really have worked on it some, a documentary regarding these various presidents. And I visited there, and we have some shots of the things that he said that we thought were so important to build this very wonderful, amazing, beautiful building, to put his words up on the walls. They're huge plaques, but they're amazing. Why is Jefferson honored in such ways? He was indeed an outstanding father of our country. He wrote what I'm calling here our country's birth certificate. He was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. He was the author of something else that people don't seem to know much about, but for him it was very important. Probably right up there with the Declaration of Independence, and that was the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, which he wrote in 1777, and then it wasn't adopted till some years later in 1785. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. It figures very importantly into Jefferson's picture. He was minister to France from 1784 to 1789, first Secretary of State under George Washington, and then the big stuff. As though this wasn't enough, what I've just mentioned. But he was Vice President of the United States from 1797 to 1801, third President of these United States from 1801 to 1809, so he served 2 terms. And this is amazing, isn't it? He actually doubled the size of the United States of America. How many presidents can say that? It was through his efforts that the Louisiana Purchase took place, and so that was astounding. We became double the size of a country overnight in his administration. He retired from public life in 1809. Other accomplishments, things I thought were interesting. He was a lawyer. He was an architect. He was the architect of Monticello. And he was a violinist. People don't know this. He practiced the violin very much every day, and he actually performed violin. Did so for the governor of Virginia once. So amazing stuff. He was the governor of Virginia at one point, and he served in the House of Burgesses for the United States Declaration of Independence. He was the founder of the University of Virginia, which was the third thing he's very proud of. First was that he was primary author of the Declaration of Independence. Second was that he was the author of this statute for religious freedom, Statute of Virginia for religious freedom. Third was that he was the founder of the University of Virginia in 1819. 6,700 books from his personal library formed the nucleus of the Library of Congress, back when they were getting the Library of Congress going on, which is, by the way, the world's largest library now, by far. And this amazes me. He wrote almost 20,000 letters in his lifetime. How do you do that? I am amazed. I have that on good source. I can't answer my emails. And he wrote 20,000 letters in his lifetime. Of course, this was before TV. You know, there wasn't a whole lot to do, so you wrote letters, right? And this was the way you communicated. You couldn't. I mentioned the Kennedy quote here. I think that President Kennedy, when he was in office, held a dinner for a special state dinner for all of the living Nobel laureates from the United States. So you have all these great people assembled there. And anyway, in his remarks, Kennedy made this statement that I thought was great. He said, this dinner tonight is probably the greatest assemblage of brain power to be in the White House since Thomas Jefferson dined here alone. So this gives us an idea of the tremendous person that we're talking about here. One of the great people, I think, of American history. One of the great people of the world, in a way. He was, nonetheless, a controversial man religiously, and that's what we really want to focus on here for the next 30 minutes or so. Someone wrote a book recently called Jefferson's Secrets, and it's a good book if you wanted to get it. Jefferson's. But I'm saying we could adapt that a little bit for our presentation here and say Jefferson's last secret, the one that maybe in his lifetime was revealed last, and that was his faith. It was somewhat of an enigma, somewhat of a questionable matter regarding what his beliefs were, what his faith was, and while he was in public life, there was not an awful lot that was said about that. So there was some things that were said, but perhaps of doubtful thoughts. Alf Mapp said this. By the way, I'm still recommending this book. If you want to know something about these presidents and others, this Faiths of Our Fathers by Alf J. Mapp, Jr. It's a small book. Covers a number of the presidents, but it's really good. He just goes right to the heart. Says a lot of things that I think are right on track, and it's a good book. The Faiths of Our Fathers. And that's a book worth having if you enjoy these things. And he will say some of the very things that I'm talking about here. Jefferson's last figure said, Alf Mapp said, this man who often spoke unguardedly on many matters was extremely reticent on the subject of his faith. He was very reserved about that and didn't have a lot to say. That reticence, though, is unwillingness to get up and have a lot to say about it in public forum. Left him open to speculations, skepticism, and even criticisms by others. Because he wasn't saying a lot about faith, it left others then out there, sometimes his political adversaries, which he did have, they had a lot to say then about what they thought that he was thinking. But our question here is, what was he thinking? So I tried to figure this out while I was visiting Monticello. And maybe we're able to determine some important things about what he was thinking about God. That's our question. But when you begin to ask this question, it's an important part of the historian's task to realize that not only what someone has said, but when they are saying it. And that's the case with Jefferson in his life. For any one of you, though many of you have a religious faith journey that didn't begin where you're at today. So if I found some of your words from back maybe years back, it might be a different picture from where you're at now. And I think, and we could say, but we would label you by whatever it would be. For me, you would say, oh, Dan Gill, he was a oneness guy. Well, actually, for a part of my life, I was. But that's not the accurate picture about who and what I have become and what I am through most of my life now. And that's not oneness, but truly one God. So what did Jefferson think? And as I say, the better question is, when did he think it? Okay. As a youth, he may have been somewhat agnostic. When he was a kid, he's trying to figure this thing out. Not even positive about that, but possibly. What did he think when he was a young legislator? There's so much we could go into about that and how he formed his impressions and opinions about how state and church should coexist, how that should work. As a revolutionary, as President of the United States, actually it is not until those years, as President of the United States, we begin to find Jefferson, the one God Jefferson. Isn't that interesting, if we can say that? He began his, what we would call non-Trinitarian years when he was president, and during those years he was in the White House. What was he thinking then in his final years and as the accomplished, experienced man of late years? Some things that we can know. Here's what I think we can be sure of. He was not an atheist. He was a person of faith, no question about that. He was, and this we touched on with John Adams just a little bit, but we'll touch on it even more here with Jefferson. You will often hear, I heard it on the radio here not too long back, radio host, talk show host, talking about Jefferson. Oh, he was a deist. So you have to figure out, what in the world are they talking about? And that's as much as most people know. Actually, that's not really an accurate view of this, and it's important because someday you may be mentioning to someone, Jefferson was a one God guy. Oh, Jefferson was a deist. That's a misunderstanding and short changes the subject, I'll put it that way. He was at best a lukewarm deist for a while, okay. Maybe not at all as deism is often defined today. Deism, this is the idea that God made the world and then took off. He no longer has anything to do with it. He just made the world and he hopes the best for us, and what he's done is he's off doing something else, and he doesn't keep up with this, he doesn't worry about it. And then in that view of God, he is the absent creator, and you don't pray because he's not there to hear you. Doesn't matter. That's deism. Okay. Jefferson, I think, did perhaps have a brush with deism. He was not a deist, though, and we'll see more about that. In his later life, he was definitely Unitarian, again with a small u. Remember, we talked about this in our first session when we talked about the background to all this. But Unitarian in the sense of the unity of God, the idea that God's not two or three different ones. God is just one individual, one being, and non-Trinitarian. And we cautioned in that first session, when you hear the word Unitarian nowadays, it probably carries a very different connotation for most people in the world than it did at that time, and what we want to do. Jefferson was very anti-tyranny of the crown and the state. Okay. And he saw established religion as part of that tyranny. He saw it as being in league with the state. Remember that all over Europe, the state France, England, whoever it may be, they sponsored or had a state religion. Okay. And then it was very difficult for other religions to exist in that environment, because whatever the state religion was would be favored by the state, protected by the state, funded by the state. And that was the way it was with the Church of England at that time. When Jefferson and his colleagues were growing up as young people back in the colonies, back when it was colonies instead of states, they were attending the Church of England, and there were problems there. Jefferson observed that though other religions were allowed to exist in America, you could have Baptist folks or whatever, and they wouldn't keep you from going to those churches. Still, you had to pay your tithes to the Church of England, regardless. And not only that, but you had to attend the Church of England service at least periodically, once every so often, and there's a record kept of this. Jefferson took a look at all of this and he said, this is awful. It's terrible. This is what set him to thinking of what he called the separation of church and state. And he did not mean by that a separation of state and God, as now has been interpreted by many people. He wasn't saying get God out of the picture. He was saying get church out of the picture. So as Jefferson proceeded, he actually very much relied upon, depended upon the help of God Almighty in the governance of the nation, believed that God was involved, and he wasn't against that. He was just against having the Church of the United States of America. He didn't want that. He said all the churches should be free to compete, so to speak, for the hearts and the minds of people on the same even ground. And there shouldn't be favoritism shown by the state. So what Jefferson meant by a separation of church and state has now been, I think, terribly abused by people. And what they're saying is not what he was saying at all. And we'll see some examples of that. By the way, this is just a thought for those of you who find this interesting, but Jefferson had no middle name. I felt badly for him for a while, and then a lot of people didn't have that. So there was no middle name for Thomas Jefferson. I don't know. They just didn't take the time to give him one. When we think about Jefferson's views, one thing we know, he was opposed in terms of his faith to some of the systems. He was particularly anti-Catholic. He felt like the Catholic Church was a part of this huge problem of the oppression, if you will, of people and the minds of people. People weren't allowed to think freely. People weren't allowed to really consider and form their own understanding of faith in a free environment. And so he blamed the church, the Catholic Church, for that. But he was also an equal opportunity disliker. He didn't like the Calvinists either. There's a lot of very strong statements. Calvinist, which has come down to us nowadays as our Presbyterian friends. But in Jefferson's day, he really didn't like that. And one quote by Sanford, who was a biographer, says, Jefferson attacked the 5 demoralizing dogmas of Calvin, which he identified as, get this one, number 1, believing in 3 gods. So this is later in life, and Jefferson has decided that the Calvinist first shot out of the chute, if you will, the idea that God is 3. He said, who are you kidding? If you're saying there are 3 who are God, then you got 3 gods. And he says, you can scramble out of that any way you want to try, but it doesn't work. So he said, the Calvinists, of course, this was true of other churches as well. We talked some in our first session about the development of the early Reformation and some of the churches that came from that. Particularly, we talked about the Anabaptists and the early Unitarians, who got beat up a lot by the Calvinists, among others. John Calvin is the one who we find who was responsible for the death of Michael Servetus, who was one of our guys He had the same view of God as we do. So it was tough going back then. But by the time Jefferson comes on the scene, he's very sharply speaking against the Calvinists, at least in his private letters. And he didn't like the fact that they were having a three-person God. He said it doesn't work. And also for denying the importance of good works and the love of your neighbor. The Calvinists would have said, oh, Jefferson, you're wrong about that, but he would have said, no, I'm not either. So that's a whole different discussion we're going to have today. Jefferson had significant political and religious enemies. In his first run for president, the Calvinists of the day accused him of being an atheist. That's just where I say he was awfully quiet. He didn't want to bring religion into the picture. That was his whole point. He had formed the idea that religion should not be mixed with politics, that religion shouldn't be a part of, one's personal religion shouldn't be a part of what you're doing out here in the political world. You shouldn't be appealing to people on the basis that I am a Catholic or I am and so on and so forth. And people have done that. But his view was that shouldn't be an issue here. We should be choosing the person for political office who is the most qualified, the most capable. And so anyway, the Calvinists said that if he was elected president, that he would empty every church in America and turn them into brothels. That's a quote. That got circulated in a little leaflet, if you will. Became pretty popular. He refused to deny the assertion that he was an atheist during the campaign, and then people took his silence to say, well, see, then he is an atheist. Otherwise, he would deny. But he was actually making a stand. He was taking a stand to say, no, my faith should not be what is at issue in our political world here. Okay. Actually, he was never an atheist. That was entirely illogical to him. As I said before, he may have had a brush with agnosticism when he was very young. At some point, his agnosticism, this is Alf Mapp again, yielded to faith. He believed that the existence of creation presupposed a creator. Actually, he just said atheism, in his view, made no sense. Never did. And so he was never an atheist. Why didn't he deny atheism? The Virginia statute for religious freedom kind of helps us to understand that. The environment that Jefferson had been in, there had already been passed in England what was called the Blasphemy Act quite some time before. That Blasphemy Act said that no one could hold public office unless they were a Christian and a Trinitarian Christian. You had to accept the doctrine of the Trinity, and you had to sign off on this. I'm going to go down and I'm going to run for, something in the local office or something. Well, then you have to sign off under the penalty of the Blasphemy Act. You could go to jail, by the way, but you sure couldn't serve in public office. So you had to go down and sign off. Oh yeah, I believe in the doctrine of the Trinity and whatever it may be. So this was important in Jefferson's mind, that we do something to set this matter right. I think he was reacting largely to that, to the Blasphemy Act and to all that stuff. But that was the way it was. Jefferson's view, again, according to Mapp, was a person's religious view should not diminish or enlarge or affect the civil capacities of the speaker or writer. So you should be able to elect someone to a civil office without concern to the fact they're either a Baptist, a Methodist, or whatever it may be. He said that shouldn't be. So I found this interesting. I took this photo then of Jefferson's gravesite, and it's interesting that he is saying here was buried. He wrote this himself. It's on an obelisk there where he's buried. And he said, here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom, and he's the father of the University of Virginia. Now, it's very interesting. What's missing on this epitaph? Pardon me? Yes, we overlooked a little detail here. Third President of the United States of America for 8 years. He didn't even put it on there. He said, these are the things I'm most proud of. These are the things that are most important to me. So, and what were they? He was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. And notice this. He was the author of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom. He wanted everybody who ever came to his gravesite to see those words. The statute here that he's referring to, the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, again, no one church should be sponsored by the state. No one church should be declared the state religion. And people shouldn't have to support that one church and so on. This was very important to him. So what he's really doing is he's seeking for religious freedom for religion. What do you think? I think it's a great idea. We're able to be here today because he was thinking things like that. We're able to be here today and not have to worry too much about, the officials coming in and breaking down our doors and saying, have you signed off on our statement of belief? That sort of thing went on. But it's Jefferson, we owe so much to him, because while other people were thinking about other things, he was really focused a lot on this. Now I say his words and thoughts have been abused a lot by people saying that he didn't want God involved in the state. That's not true, but he did believe that he didn't want a church to be the state religion, state faith. Separation of church and state, very important. Jefferson then was not a true deist. We talked about that, and I mention it again because you hear this so much. He may have entertained some deism in measure along the way. However, he supported a national day of prayer. And he, in the Declaration of Independence, said, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. That's not a deist statement. There is no divine anything to protect us. Not in deism. Because the divine is gone off somewhere else. In his first inaugural address, he says, an overruling providence. He talks about an overruling providence which by all its dispensations, by the way, that was just language of the day for talking about God. An overruling providence which by all its dispensations proves that it delights in the happiness of man here and greater happiness hereafter. So we begin to see that Jefferson's faith is in an active, involved God. That's not deism. So it's terribly misunderstood. I like this next statement that he said at his second inaugural in 1805. And he said, I shall need, he says to the people, I shall need also favor of that being in whose hands we are. Wow. Who led our forefathers as Israel of old. Wow. Who led our forefathers. So Jefferson's looking back to the people first coming to America, their forefathers who came to this continent for religious freedom and so on. And he's saying, God led them. God brought them here. And this goes on, but it's wonderful statements about the intervention of God. And he says, we're going to need His work and His intervention with us. I rest my case about the deism thing. I wouldn't have brought it up much, except it's become such a misunderstanding among the public. So you'll hear that very often. I've read it in books. But if you keep reading a little deeper, you discover that's just not true. If you want to understand what someone really believed, don't always believe what somebody said about them. Go back and read their own words from their own letters, their own writings and speeches. So then you know. So here's an interesting thing, and one biographer wrote this. He talks about the term deist was actually sometimes used to indicate anyone who denied the Trinity. So what was really going on with the use of the word deist by or regarding Jefferson, was it actually this use of the word to refer to people? And he says when Jefferson used the term deism with reference to the teachings of Jesus or the religion of the Jews, he understood the word meant belief in one God. Wow. As opposed to multiple persons. We find the one God, the Unitarian Jefferson then, particularly in his later non-public years, this begins to really flow. And it's amazing that we would be able to sit down and have a conversation with this gentleman, and as regards the issues about God and how you look at God and how many He is, Jefferson would have talked all afternoon with you. He would have enjoyed that a lot. Jefferson became friends with Joseph Priestley. I think that was a key to how he became of this one God perspective. And in Priestley we talked about in our first session, and we talked about what an influential fellow he was. But Priestley was a Unitarian, little U, not the big U stuff, but he was a Unitarian minister from England. He got ran out of England. They burned down his house. They burned down his church. He finally got the message and said, I don't think they want me here. So he went to the U.S. and came to the United States, and turns out had great influence with many people, including Jefferson. Jefferson came to know him. And he was a very powerful fellow, Joseph Priestley. Priestley, in our first session, again, we talked about the rationalistic aspects of some of the Unitarians that set up for a gain of rationalism, if you will, that we would never go there. It became non-biblical Unitarianism. And that's where we get the Unitarian Universalists today. That's not at all these guys. That's not what they meant by the term and so on. But anyway, Priestley did wonderfully. He was a brilliant fellow. He was a great scientist. Him and Benjamin Franklin became buddies after he came to the United States. He was also friends. Jefferson was also friends with other Unitarian clergy, and he kindled in those years a new friendship with his old political adversary. We talked about this before, John Adams. But John Adams had been a long-term Unitarian, and we talked about him in our last session. So if we can, this is another little clip from Peacefield. Again, it needs editing and other work and so on. So it's interesting that our study about Jefferson and Jefferson's interesting religious perspectives, his religious views, actually, in a way, ends here in Quincy, Massachusetts, at the home of John Adams. And it is only when we get those two things together that we get to see the whole picture about Jefferson, his faith, and the things that he really believed. Jefferson's last secret, I think, in many ways, really was the secret of his faith. What did he really believe? Much was said about him over time by political adversaries and others. What did he really think? I think the letters between Jefferson and Adams reveal that to us perhaps better than any other source that we have. Jefferson wrote to Adams, this is one of those examples. He wrote to Adams regarding the idea of the Trinity, and Jefferson wrote to him and said, ideas must be distinct before reason can act upon them. And no man ever had a distinct idea of the Trinity. It is the mere abracadabra of the mountebanks calling themselves priests of Jesus. He referred to them, this is Calvinist to him, or others, as well as the Catholic Church. He didn't like this idea of three being God. He said it doesn't work, it never has made sense, and you can't act upon that in any sensible way. He later also wrote this to John Adams. It is too late in the day for men of sincerity to pretend they believe in the Platonic mysticisms that three are one and one is three, and yet that the one is not three and the three are not one. But this constitutes the craft the power and the profit of the priests. So, wow, as I say, if you visited Monticello in his later years, Jefferson would greet you at the door, as he often did, and then you would come in, but if you began to talk to him about this stuff, you might spend a week. He wouldn't let you go because he would be so fascinated with our faith. And we, I think, would just really enjoy talking to him about the things that he believed along these lines. I like this statement. In 1823, Jefferson wrote this to Adams, and it's what I'm calling a very one God, Unitarian with a little u, statement. Jefferson espoused, this is Maps again, Jefferson espoused the traditional view of eternal life. Like Adams, in contemplating death, he was content to submit to the will of, now listen to this is good, the will of the God of Jesus and our God. So he's our God, and he's the God of Jesus. Have you ever heard a statement any better made? That could come straight out of our mouths, couldn't it? He is the God of Jesus. And Jefferson, in his, this is getting toward his last years here, but he said he's willing to trust himself to his God, the God of Jesus Christ. And what a wonderful one God statement that is. I love that. So what do you think? I think this is pretty great stuff, isn't it? When we're talking about Thomas Jefferson, we're talking about one of America's great presidents. We're probably talking about one of the greatest figures in American history and a great figure in world history. He's had a tremendous impact, a tremendous effect on so many people. And when it came to this one God business, he was right on track. He was right there with us. I love that very much so. He saw through the tradition on that and saw that it wasn't scriptural and it didn't make sense. And so he was right on track with us there. I love that. However, on the other side of the matter, I have to say, by way of full disclosure, that Jefferson also had a downside. Some things of which we would not at all approve and would not work for us at all. And that is, he fell into the liberal strand, if you will. We talked about there was the liberal, non-biblical so much, not entirely non-biblical, but non-biblical version of the early Unitarian people. Jefferson fell into that. And as such, he questioned things like the virgin birth of Christ. And he questioned things even like the resurrection. He questioned that Christ died for sinners in that sense. So this is a lot of things that, to us, his views on that would be utterly ridiculous, non-scriptural, non-faith, whatever you want to say. So we can't take up for Jefferson in that regard. He was right on track when it came to this one God business, though, no question about that. And so we're happy about that. But these other things, in that, Jefferson represents that liberal turn among some of the folks in post-Reformation times. He represents that liberal strain. And we shouldn't think that that's something unique to him, though, because I see Trinitarians. I run into them who sometimes are saying the same kinds of things. So they don't believe in Christ died for sinners. You know, that sort of thing. I have seen entire Trinitarian churches where that they don't preach that Jesus died for the sins of people. They don't like to talk about the blood of Christ. And so you see all that. So it doesn't have anything to do with the base issue about how many God is. Jefferson was right about that. And that we're happy about. Now, I will say this. In our next session, we're going to talk about the fellow that I think best represents our biblical one God, biblical Unitarian view, and that was John Quincy Adams. And when it comes to John Quincy Adams, he's a hero. He's a great guy. I think he was a one-God fellow, just as we've been saying. He believed that God is not two or three persons. He knew that was something that came after Bible times. And he saw through all that. Great. But John Quincy Adams also was very biblical oriented, as are we. So we find in him, he was right there when it came to issues about the gospel and the message of the gospel and the resurrection and Jesus dying for the sins of the people. He was right with us. So if you want to track back our perspective as a people who assemble in this congregation, you will find it better in John Quincy Adams than you will in Jefferson. Wow. So next time, it's going to be exciting. We're going to take a look at John Quincy Adams, who is, to me, maybe a really great example. Maybe the greatest example, certainly among the presidents we're talking about, of a biblical Unitarian, a biblical one-God guy, which is what we're here. That's what we are. So the Lord bless you very much.